Welcome back to America Decides. Capitol Hill has seen its fair share of heated exchanges, but last week was, well, unusually chaotic.
Kevin McCarthy walked by and he elbowed me in the kidneys as he walked by.
You're quite confident this was deliberate?
If you want to run your mouth, we can be two consenting adults. We can finish it here.
Okay, that's fine. Perfect.
You want to do it now?
I'd love to do it right now.
Well, stand your butt up then.
You stand your butt up.
Oh, hold on.
Big guy.
Oh, stop it.
You're doing stuff with your brother. The American people have the same questions. Why should they believe you? Why should they believe you?
Yale University History and American Studies professor Joanne Freeman joins us now. Professor, we really appreciate you coming. You're the author of The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress, and the Road to Civil War. We appreciate all of your scholarship and reporting. Using your vantage point from history, what do you make of what has happened in Washington in the past week? Is this something that's unusual, or is this something that is indicative of deeper dynamics in the country when it comes to social unrest and political unease?
I'm going to be a real historian and say both. And on the first hand, I would say that there's a long history of misbehavior in Congress, right? The book that I wrote that you just had the cover of talks about physical violence in Congress leading up to the Civil War between 1830 and 1860. And I found roughly 70 physically violent incidents in the House and Senate. Now, a lot of them were deliberate. A lot of them had to do with Southerners trying to bully Northerners into silence on the question of slavery. So on the one hand, in American politics generally and in Congress, there is a history of violence, a lot of it behind the scenes. Some of the violent incidents I researched actually were censored out of the record. But that all said, what we're seeing now, and I think that was particularly true with Senator Mullen in the Senate hearing, we're seeing the normalization of a certain amount of threats, violence, behavior that, as Bernie Sanders said, you're a U.S. Senator, sit down. As a historian, writing about a time period when there were Southerners bullying others and there were Northerners essentially saying now and again, sit down, this is the U.S. Congress, the echoes are eerie. And I'm not saying, and I always feel the need to say this, I'm not announcing I think we're on the edge of a civil war, but what I am saying is that what's interesting about this moment is people who are not only feeling free to be violent or threatening in that way, but are proud of it. Senator Mullen, I think, on an interview that he said his constituents want him to behave in that way. There's one of the members of Congress in my book said that roughly 1842. So, I would hope that that's not true for most of the constituents of that particular senator, but we're seeing in any number of ways, and just in the last week or so also in the rhetoric coming from presidential candidate Donald Trump, a degree of violence, rhetoric, but more than rhetoric, because rhetoric makes it sound kind of ethereal and non-threatening. These are threats. And this is not the way a democratic polity operates. It doesn't operate based on threats. There are systems, there are policies, there's a constitution, there's the rule of law, there are all kinds of rules in Congress. There are any number of things that should be taking hold of this moment and aren't.
Professor, we so often use the word, and hear the word at least, unprecedented when it comes to this moment in American politics. But in your book, you write about how in 1856, Congressman Preston Brooks used a cane to beat Senator Charles Sumner. What was the reaction to that in Washington, and was that a flashpoint in that era?
Well, it was a flashpoint. Partly, people assume that the caning of Charles Sumner is the only violent incident in Congress, and it was far from it. It came after a series of violent incidents, one right after another. It particularly, and I don't mean to be using a pun here, struck home, not just in Washington, but more so in the North and South, because it was literally in the Senate chamber, a South Carolina representative beating a Massachusetts senator to the ground with a cane, breaking the cane in the process of beating him. So this was an actual physical beating. It was also highly symbolic. So in the South, They cheered Brooks on. They sent him celebratory canes. In the North, they held what they called indignation meetings, which are precisely what they sound like. Meetings of people who got together and said, this is not how the North can be treated. And part of the response to not specifically the caning of Sumner, but that kind of behavior was that Northerners began to elect more assertive members of Congress. People who would come to Congress and said, and actually would rise to their feet when bullied by Southerners, they would say, we're not here to be treated that way anymore. We're going to push back. They didn't necessarily come wanting to fight, but they made it very clear that they were not going to roll over for that kind of bullying anymore. And, you know, it made a difference. It didn't solve problems, but it certainly, at least temporarily, cowed Southerners or schooled Southerners in the fact that they did not own the floor of the Capitol, the House and Senate.
And just briefly here, in about 30 seconds, Professor, it is Thanksgiving week. Any quick advice to those who are facing contentious conversations at the dinner table later this week?
I guess I would say to them what I would say about American politics generally, which is don't normalize violent talk. Don't assume that because a presidential candidate is talking this way, or your Uncle Bert, that that's normal, right? That it shouldn't be that way. Now, there aren't magical words to make your Uncle Bert behave better, nor to make presidential candidate Donald Trump behave better. But it's worth remembering that things don't have to be that way, that you don't have to put up with that kind of behavior, and that you can sort of move on at the Thanksgiving table. On the national scene, we have to be pretty aware and alert about the fact that this is not a normal election. I'm hoping that everyone out there has a very normal, pleasant Thanksgiving.
The stakes are high with this election. I think we got the title of your next book, How to Deal with Uncle Bert. Professor Freeman, thank you. We appreciate it.